You work harder every year, and somehow you fall further behind. That's not a coincidence. In 2024, the 3 wealthiest individuals on Earth held more combined wealth than the bottom 4 billion people combined. Not 3 companies, not 3 governments, 3 people. And right now, somewhere in a building you'll never enter, in a meeting you'll never hear about, a small group of unelected individuals is deciding what interest rate to charge the world, what your mortgage costs, whether your job survives next quarter, whether the currency in your wallet is worth what it was this morning. But wait, before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment "I subscribe" below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. You didn't vote for them. You were never asked. And here's the part that should make you stop scrolling. Everything you were taught about how the economy works was a simplified story, designed to make you feel like a participant, when really, you're the product. If you've ever worked harder year after year and still felt like you were running in place, this video is going to explain exactly why. And more importantly, what the people who understand this are quietly doing about it. Stay with me, because it gets darker before it gets useful. Let's start with a story. Marcus is 52 years old, Detroit. Spent 2 decades working in automotive manufacturing, saving carefully, living modestly. In 2021, he finally had enough to open a small parts supply business. His dream. Everything he'd sacrificed for. He applied for a business loan in early 2022. The numbers worked. The business plan was solid. The banker shook his hand. Then the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. Not once, but 7 times in a single year. The most aggressive rate hiking cycle in 40 years. Marcus's loan repayment jumped by $800 a month before he'd even opened his doors. The business he'd spent 20 years building toward, gone before it started. Here's what nobody told Marcus, and what they don't teach in schools. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a private institution, governed by a board of directors, that controls the price of money for the most powerful economy on Earth. It has never been fully audited. Its meetings are private, and its decisions ripple through every mortgage, every credit card rate, every business loan in the world. An IMF working paper from 2023 found that central bank interest rate decisions disproportionately impact lower-income households, with 78% experiencing significant disruptions to employment and credit access during rate tightening cycles. Marcus isn't a cautionary tale about risk management. Marcus is a data point in a system that was never designed with him in mind. Think of it like a casino, except the house doesn't just have better odds. The house changes the rules while you're playing, and you only find out when you check your chips. But here's what's more unsettling than the Federal Reserve. Because the Fed, at least we know its name. The forces we're about to discuss, most people have never even heard of them. 5 forces, quietly steering your financial reality. Every single day, we're counting down from significant to almost unbelievable. Number 5, central banks.
You know this one now. They set interest rate. They control credit. They can manufacture recessions or fuel booms, sometimes deliberately, sometimes as collateral damage. The Bank for International Settlements, nicknamed the Central Bank of Central Banks, coordinates policy between 63 national central banks globally. It meets in Basel. Switzerland attendance is by invitation only. When these institutions align on a direction, every economy on Earth feels it. Number 4, the IMF and World Bank. These were created after World War II to stabilize global finance and help developing nations. A noble mission on paper. But here's what a 2022 Cambridge University study found after reviewing 165 countries that received IMF loans. 91 of them, 91, implemented mandatory cuts to healthcare or education spending within 3 years of receiving aid. That's the condition. You need the money, you reshape your society to qualify for it. Myanmar Point, 34 years old. Lagos, Nigeria. Built a modest distribution business over 6 years. Smart, tireless, strategically sound. In 2023, Nigeria's currency, the naira, lost 40% of its value in under 8 months. Part of financial restructuring tied to IMF conditions on Nigeria's debt obligations. Fuel subsidies were cut. Transport costs exploded. Amara's operating costs tripled overnight. She didn't vote for this policy. No Nigerian citizen was asked. The restructuring was negotiated between financial ministers and international creditors. In rooms Amara will never enter, about a life she spent everything building. That's not tragedy, that's architecture. Number 3, sovereign wealth funds Norway, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, China. These governments manage enormous investment funds, built from oil revenues, trade surpluses, national reserves. Together, sovereign wealth funds control over $11 trillion in global assets. They quietly own stakes in airports, tech companies, real estate developments, energy infrastructure, and media organizations across dozens of countries. When Norway's government pension fund, the world's largest, decides to divest from a sector, entire industries feel it. When the Saudi Public Investment Fund buys into a technology company, geopolitics and economics fuse in ways that don't make the evening news silent, enormous, permanent. Number 2, the asset management giants BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. As of 2024, BlackRock alone manages over $10 trillion in assets, more than the GDP of every nation on Earth, except the United States and China. These 3 firms are simultaneously among the largest shareholders of Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, ExxonMobil, and thousands of other companies. They don't just invest in the economy. In many sectors, they are the economy. When they vote on corporate governance, executives listen. When they signal concern about a market sector, analysts publish. When they shift allocation strategies, markets follow. They don't sit in government. They don't need influence. At that scale, doesn't need a title. But wait, you said there were 5. What's number 1? It's not a bank. It's not a fund. It's not a building you can point at on a map. And it might be the most powerful economic force in human history. We'll get there. But first, let's talk about something that connects all 5 of these forces. Something called the debt machine. Stop what you're doing, just for a second. In 2024, global debt reached $313 trillion. That's not a government number. That's not corporate debt alone. That figure, published by the Institute of International Finance, represents the combined debt of households, corporations, and governments worldwide, divided equally across every human being alive on Earth today. That's roughly $40,000 per person, including the baby born in a rural clinic in Myanmar this morning, including the 8-year-old in a village without electricity, including you, including me. We are all at birth inherited participants in a debt system we never agreed to. Now here's why that matters economically, not just philosophically. Nations carrying significant debt don't get to set their own priorities freely. Loan conditions, bond market pressure, credit rating dependencies. These create invisible fences around what a government can and cannot do for its citizens. That Cambridge study I mentioned, 91 of 165 nations cutting health care after IMF loans. That's not negligence. That's the price of the loan. Health care for liquidity, education for credit access, social spending for debt servicing. The population pays the cost of transactions they never participated in. And it's not just happening at the national level, it's happening to you. Because when interest rates rise designed to cool inflation, who absorbs the shock? Not the asset holders, not the major corporations with locked fixed rate financing. The shock lands on the person whose variable mortgage just jumped $400 a month, on the small business that can't refinance, on the family that was this close to getting ahead. That's when things got darker, because while you're navigating all of that, someone else is buying your house. James and Priya are 29, living in Toronto, both working professionals. Combined income comfortably above median. saved aggressively for 3 years. By every conventional measure, they did everything right. They were outbid on 11 homes, not by families offering slightly more, not by downsizers with equity, by numbered companies, corporate entities whose names revealed nothing about who was behind them. After months of research, James traced one of the competing buyers. It was a subsidiary of a real estate investment division, itself owned by a fund that managed pension and institutional assets. It had no intention of living in that house. It had algorithms optimizing acquisition rates across multiple cities simultaneously. James and Priya weren't losing to a lucky buyer. They were competing against a machine that doesn't sleep, doesn't need a mortgage, and considers human shelter a yield-generating asset class. This is not a Toronto story. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies reported in 2023 that institutional investors purchased 28% of all single-family starter homes in the United States. In some Sun Belt cities, that number exceeded 40% in specific price ranges. The starter home, the traditional entry point into generational wealth for middle-class families, is being systematically acquired by entities for whom housing is not a home. It is a portfolio position. And here's the part that should make your jaw tighten. Many of those institutional buyers are funded by pension plans, including possibly yours. The system is feeding on itself and calling it an investment return. Now, before we get to the biggest reveal, I want to give you something real. Because this video isn't about making you feel powerless. It's about making you see clearly. And people who see clearly can act. Here's what some people are already doing. Banking with credit unions member-owned, not shareholder-driven, and statistically more likely to approve small business and first-home loans in underserved communities. Understanding index fund, exposure knowing whether your retirement savings are managed by the very asset giants we discussed, and what alternatives exist. Investing in secondary housing markets, James and Priya eventually did this, bought in a smaller city, built equity faster, and are now better positioned than peers who kept fighting over the same overheated markets. These aren't magic solutions. The system is real. The scale is real, but informed people make different choices than people operating on incomplete information. And the most powerful tool for keeping you operating on incomplete information is what we're about to talk about. Number one on our list, the thing that makes all the others possible. Number one, the story you're told about money, not a bank, not a fund, not a policy. A narrative, whoever controls what feels normal, controls everything downstream of normal in the United States. 90% of mainstream media is owned by 6 corporations, according to a 2023 analysis by Free Press. 6. For a nation of 330 million people consuming news, entertainment, financial commentary, and political framing, 6 ownership groups set the tone of the conversation. Now think about the language used to describe economic events when a major bank nearly collapses. It's called systemic risk event requiring emergency stabilization measures. When a family loses their home, it's called foreclosure resulting from poor financial decisions. Same economic collapse, same forces, same failure of a leverage system. Different language, different moral weight, different public response. Elena knows this better than most. She's 61, retired school teacher, Athens, Greece. She lived through the 2010 sovereign debt crisis, one of the most severe austerity programs ever imposed on a European nation. The news called it a necessary adjustment. She told an interviewer, a correction. I called it watching my neighbor choose between heating and eating. I called it my husband's insulin going from 12 euros to 47 euros in 1 year because the pharmacy subsidies were cut. The system is feeding on itself and calling it an investment return. Now, before we get to the biggest reveal, I want to give you something real. Because this video isn't about making you feel powerless. It's about making you see clearly. And people who see clearly can act. Here's what some people are already doing. Banking with credit unions member-owned, not shareholder-driven, and statistically more likely to approve small business and first-home loans in underserved communities. Understanding index fund, exposure knowing whether your retirement savings are managed by the very asset giants we discussed, and what alternatives exist. Investing in secondary housing markets, James and Priya eventually did this. Bought in a smaller city, built equity faster, and are now better positioned than peers who kept fighting over the same overheated markets. These aren't magic solutions. The system is real. The scale is real, but informed people make different choices than people operating on incomplete information. And the most powerful tool for keeping you operating on incomplete information is what we're about to talk about. Number one on our list, the thing that makes all the others possible. Number one, the story you're told about money, not a bank, not a fund, not a policy. A narrative, whoever controls what feels normal, controls everything downstream of normal in the United States. 90% of mainstream media is owned by 6 corporations, according to a 2023 analysis by Free Press. 6. For a nation of 330 million people consuming news, entertainment, financial commentary, and political framing, 6 ownership groups set the tone of the conversation. Now think about the language used to describe economic events when a major bank nearly collapses. It's called systemic risk event requiring emergency stabilization measures. When a family loses their home, it's called foreclosure resulting from poor financial decisions. Same economic collapse, same forces, same failure of a leverage system. Different language, different moral weight, different public response. Elena knows this better than most. She's 61, retired school teacher, Athens, Greece. She lived through the 2010 sovereign debt crisis, one of the most severe austerity programs ever imposed on a European nation. The news called it a necessary adjustment. She told an interviewer, a correction. I called it watching my neighbor choose between heating and eating. I called it my husband's insulin going from 12 euros to 47 euros in 1 year because the pharmacy subsidies were cut. Necessary adjustment correction, the language didn't change what happened, but it changed how the world responded to what happened. And it changed whether the people responsible were held accountable or thanked for their difficult decisions. Here's the research that should genuinely unsettle you. A 2021 Oxford Internet Institute study found that financial news framing directly predicts consumer spending behavior with a measurable 6-week lag. What that means in plain language, the stories you read today about the economy shape the financial decisions you make next month. Not because you're gullible, because you're human, because we navigate reality through narrative. All of us. If the dominant narrative is inflation is caused by workers demanding too much public pressure targets wages. If the dominant narrative is inflation is caused by corporate profit-taking public pressure targets pricing practices, same inflation. Different story, different political outcome, different policy response, different distribution of pain. Whoever writes the first draft of economic reality controls the response to it. And when you look at who funds the think tanks, who sits on the boards of the media companies, who provides the expert commentary on financial news channels, the overlap with the asset managers and institutional forces we've already discussed is not accidental. It is the architecture. So here's the full picture. Central banks control the price of money. The IMF controls the conditions for money. Sovereign wealth funds control the movement of money. Asset management giants control the ownership of assets. And the narrative machine controls what you think is possible, which controls everything else. They don't need a conspiracy. They don't need a secret room. They just need everyone to keep believing the story is about their personal choices, their discipline, their hustle, their fault, while the architecture stays invisible. Here's where I want to be careful with you, because the goal of this video is not to make you feel like a helpless pawn. That feeling, that paralysis, is actually what keeps the system stable. Outrage without direction is just noise. So let's talk about what the people who understand this are actually doing. 1, follow the ownership. Before you bank, invest, or subscribe, ask who owns the institution. Credit unions return profits to members. Community development financial institutions direct capital into underserved areas.